An Official's Blessing. Tian Sifu by Mo Xiang Dong Xiu. Chapter 6. Clothes redder than maple, skin white as snow. Of course, those words he would never say out loud, but no wonder Nanfeng and Fu Yao's faces changed when they heard about the silver butterflies. They must have had a hard time at the hands of the silver butterflies' master, together with the two generals they served. Your Highness, did did Hua Cheng do anything to you? An official asked, as if Celian should be missing an arm or a leg. He didn't really do anything. He just. Celian stopped at a loss for words. He just what? He couldn't possibly say that Hua Cheng just hijacked his sedan and held his hand and strolled with him in the woods. Stumped for a moment, Celian finally said, "He broke Sunji's enchantment array at Mount Yuzun and took me inside." The heavenly officials all grumbled inwardly, but remained in an uneasy silence. After a while, an official finally asked, "What do you all think of this?" From the voice alone, Celian could imagine how the various officials looked as they shook their heads and shrugged. Who knows? Completely no idea. No one knows what he wants. How scary! What on earth is he thinking? No one can read that, Huatong. Although Huatong had been ubiquitously known as the devil incarnate, Celian didn't think it was that scary. All things considered, Celian had to thank Huatong for his help in the northern case this time around. Either way, his first mission after Ascension was complete. It was predetermined that all merits from the northern case would be counted under Celian's name, but that old lord official was so overwhelmed with grief over the death of his daughter that he didn't actually remember to fulfill the promises of his prayers until much later, and the merits were discounted because he did so mournfully. Yet, somehow, with a little bit here and a little bit there and a lot of oversight everywhere, Celian was finally able to repay most of the 8,880,000 merits. Celian was at last debt-free, feeling light with the weight off his shoulders, happy and high-spirited. Celian decided he'd now focus on being a good god, and it would be great if he could become acquaintances or friends with other heavenly officials. Even though the upper court communication ray was generally peaceful, it would turn boisterous once things got busy. Sometimes an official was feeling good or had encountered something interesting, they'd share in the array, and there'd be merriment. Although Celian didn't recognize most of the voices, he would listen silently. But he couldn't always remain invisible. After a while, he'd randomly join the conversation. "That's quite interesting. I read this pleasant verse in passing and thought I'd share it with everyone. Here's an effective little cure for back and leg pains. Thought I'd share with everyone." Unfortunately, every time he'd share these mindfully selected, physically and mentally beneficial chips, the communication array would go silent. Finally, Ling Wen couldn't take it anymore and told him privately, "Your Highness, what you're sharing in the communication array is nice, but even those who are hundreds of years older than you wouldn't share those kinds of things." Celian felt a little depressed. He wasn't even that old. How did he end up becoming the senior among the heavenly officials who couldn't keep up with the trending topics of the youngsters? Probably because he'd been away for too long and always lived a solitary life without a care for the outside world. Alas, it couldn't be helped. So, whatever. He gave up and became less depressed. But there was another problem. There were still no shrines built for him in the mortal realm. Maybe there were, but the heavens hadn't found them, so there weren't any records. Even the old lords of ground and soil had shrines. As formerly ascended official, one of three times. One of. Blah, I was doing so good. As a formerly ascended official, one of three times at that, having neither shrine nor temple nor followers was pretty awkward. But as awkward as it was only other heavenly officials feeling awkward for him. Celian personally thought it wasn't that bad. And one day, on a whim, he suddenly thought, "If no one worships me, I'll worship myself." None of the heavenly officials knew how to respond to that. Who would ever fucking heard of a god worshipping himself to reach such tragic heights. What was the point? However, Cillian was used to receiving nothing but awkward silence the moment he spoke, and thought amusing himself could be fun. Once he made up his mind, he jumped back down to the mortal realm. This time, he landed a small village in the mountains. It was known as Puzi, named for the water chestnut. Rather than a village, it was more like a hillside hamlet with green trees and clear waters. It was a pleasant country landscape with continuous stretches of rice paddies. With such beautiful scenery, Cillian thought he'd landed in a really good place this time. When he looked further, he saw there was a small, dilapidated shack up on a hill, and upon asking around, the villagers told him, that shack is decrepit. There's no owner, and vagrants sleep a night in there every once in a while, so you can go make yourself at home. Oh, wasn't that just perfect for him? Celian walked toward the shack. As Celian got closer, he realized the shack looked decrepit from afar, but upon closer inspection, it was literally crumbling. Two of the four columns that held up the rectangle shaped shack were probably rotted through. When the wind blew, the entire shack would shake and creak, possibly ready to collapse at any time, but it was still within Celian's range of acceptable. He went in to look and he went in for a look and began to tidy up the place. The villagers were quite surprised to see that someone was actually going to settle in that little shack, and came to check Celian out. They gave Celian a huge, warm welcome. Not only did they donate a broom to help with cleaning and watch as he swept until he was covered in dust, but even gave him a basket of freshly picked water chestnuts. With their skin peeled off, the water chestnuts were pure white and crisp, fresh and juicy. Celian squatted on the doorstep and ate them. He then put his hands together and, feeling thankful for this blessing, decided to call the place Puchi Shrine. Puti's shrine already had a table inside that could be used as an altar. After a couple of wipe downs, Celian busied himself with cleaning this and that, and the onlooking villagers soon realized that this young man was building a shrine of sorts. Curiosity overtook them, and they questioned him. Which god are you going to worship? Celian cleared his throat and said, yes, this shrine will be for the Prince of Sinla. Everyone's face went blank. Who's that? Celine replied, I don't know either. He's a prince, I think. Oh, well, what does he do? Probably watches over you and keeps you safe. While collecting scraps and passing. The villagers asked excitedly, then does this prince oversee the blessing of wealth? It'd already be pretty good if you didn't get blessed into debt, Cillian thought to himself and gently replied, I'm afraid not. The crowd started throwing suggestions at him. Why not worship the Water Master for wealth? It'll bring in good money for the temple. Or what about Lingwen Zhenjun? Maybe then our village will produce a scholar. A girl, a girl shyly offered. Um, what about, what about, Cillian maintained a smile. What about General Yang? If Cillian really built a Duyang shrine, Feng Xin would probably shoot him dead on the spot with an arrow. After roughly tidying his shrine, all that was left that Cillian needed were an incense burner, some fortune shakers, and other miscellaneous sundries. But Cillian forgot the most important thing, a statue of the god. He carried his bamboo hat on his back and stepped out the door. Oh yeah, there was no door either. He pondered for a moment. This shack definitely had to be repaired. And so Celian wrote a sign and put the sign out front. Please kindly donate to the renovation of this broken shrine for the accumulation of good merits. Celian left, walked 3 to 4 kilometers and entered town. To do what? To get a life, of course. So he went to do what he did best. In fairy tales, gods didn't need to eat. But in truth, it was hard to say. The Almighty could certainly extract and absorb the necessary spiritual energy directly from sunshine and rain dew, but the problem was it wasn't a matter of ability, but rather, why would you? Some gods, due to their cultivation methods, required clean internal organs and could not touch even a drop of mortal grease. If they were to ingest mortal sustenance, it would be as if they'd been struck with food poisoning and they would get diarrhea. Thus, they would only ingest cleanly grown spiritual fruits or magical beasts that had life prolonging and power strengthening effects. Celian didn't have those problems. With a cursed collar, he was no different than a mortal. He could eat anything, and through experience, nothing he ate could kill him either. Even if it was a bun that had been set aside for over a month or a cake that had gone moldy, he could eat it all without harm. With such a body, he could pretty much just get by collecting scraps. To compare them, building a shrine cost him money, while collecting scraps made him money. So ultimately, truly collecting scraps was better than ascension. Celian had the looks and grace of a saint, so he had the upper hand when collecting scraps. It took him almost no time to collect a giant bag. On the way back, he saw an old ox cart that had piled high with hay. The cart looked like one he'd seen before in Pucci village, so it should be going the same way. He asked for a ride, and the cart driver tilted his chin to signal for him to get on. Carrying his big bundle of junk, Celian climbed on to take a seat. It was only when he'd settled down when he realized there was someone else lying on the other side of the tall stack of hay. This person, whose upper body was hidden behind the hay, had his left leg crossed over his right. It appeared that he was lying there with arms pillowed behind his head, taking a rest. He looked so carefree and at ease, it made Celian a little bit envious. That tight pair of black boots on a pair of long legs was a sight pleasing to the eyes, and it reminded Celian of a different pair that walked with him at Mount Yuzun. Celian could not help but sneak several more hooks to confirm that there were no silver chains on those boots, which seemed to be made of animal pelt. This is probably a young master coming out to play, he thought. The cart shook as it drove languidly. Celian pushed back his bamboo hat and took out a scroll to read. He didn't really care for worldly affairs, but after having created too many awkward situations, he figured best do some studying. The cart rattled and time passed. Looking up, they were traversing the maple grove, a sea of flaming red and a field of green. The rustic charm of the mountainous countryside, with fresh grass that refreshed the mind, it was extremely intoxicating. But Celian could not help but be slightly taken aback. A long time ago in his youth, when he cultivated at the Royal Holy Temple, the entire mountain was of maple like this, shimmering like gold, intense like fire. The unforgettable sight before him now inevitably took him on a trip down memory lane. Celian watched for a long time before looking down at the scroll. The first few lines on the scroll were thus: The Prince of Xianla ascended thrice as a martial god, a misfortune god, and a rubbish god. Well, all right, Celian said out loud. If you think about it, a martial god is no different than a rubbish god. All gods are equal. All beings are equal. A snicker came from behind, and a voice said, Is that right? The youth on the other side of the cart lazily continued in a drawl. People naturally love saying that all gods are equal and all beings are equal, but if that were true, then pretty much all those different gods wouldn't exist. Celian looked at the boy, who was still lying there idly without showing any intention of getting up. He likely interrupted out of boredom. You're probably right, Celian said and smiled. Celian returned to his scroll and continued reading. Further down the line read, Many believe that as the god of misfortune, any paintings or writings of the Prince of Sinla have the powers of a curse. If placed on the back of a person or on the main entrance of a household, then the cursed person or household will run into all sorts of bad luck. It was hard to tell whether this was a description of a god or a ghost. Celian shook his head. He couldn't bear to read any more about himself. It was probably better to read about the other prominent gods of today, so he wouldn't be discourteous if he ran into them and ended up not being able to tell them apart. A villager had mentioned the Watermaster earlier, so Celian moved on to find the description of the Watermaster. The Watermaster Voodoo controls water and simultaneously wealth. Most merchants have a Watermaster shrine in their stores and homes to generate their wealth. Cillian thought this was strange. Why would a god of water control the wealth? The youth behind the hay responded. When merchants transport goods, their cargo is mainly sent on the waterways. So they always go to the Watermaster Temple and light a tall incense to pray for safe journey, promising this or that when they return. After a while, the Watermaster gradually came to control wealth. The youth was actually answering questions especially for him. Cillian turned around. Really? Interesting. The Watermaster must be a very powerful major god then. The youth sneered. Yeah, though he's the water tyrant after all. Judging by tone, Cillian didn't think the boy took that particular her heavenly official all that seriously. It didn't sound like he was complimenting him either. What's the water tyrant? The youth replied leisurely. When a ship travels down a major river, all depends on him whether the ship can set sail or not. No offerings means capsizing. Pretty tyrannical. So that's how he received the nickname. Kind of like General Zhu and the Sweeping General. Famous gods usually had a nickname or two between all the realms. For example, Cillian is known as the lacking stock of the three realms, the infamous freak, the jinx, the loser, etc., etc. Usually it was fairly disrespectful to those using. Usually it was fairly disrespectful to use those nicknames on heavenly officials. Like if anyone were to call Mu Ting the sweeping general, he'd surely fly into a rage. Cillian made a note to himself on what to call the Watermaster and said, I see. Thank you so much for enlightening me. He paused briefly, thinking this youth to be rather intriguing and conversationalist. He continued, My friend, you look young, but you know a lot. The youth replied, Nah, just bored. I read and I'm free, that's all. In the mortal realm, it was easy to find books on lore that spoke of the stories of gods and ghosts, the subjects ranging from their kindness and grudges to trivialities. Some were real, some were fake. It wasn't odd that the youth knew so much. Cillian put down his scroll. Then, my friend, you know about gods, but do you know about ghosts too? Which ghost? The youth asked. Cillian replied, Crimson rain-sought flower, Huatang. The youth chuckled and finally sat up when he heard that name. He turned around, and Cillian's eyes suddenly lit up. The youth was about 16 or 17 years old. His tunic was redder than the maple leaves, and his skin was white like snow. With eyes the color of as bright as stars, he looked askance at him with a smile. He was exceptionally handsome, but there was an inescapable hint of wildness in his looks. His hair was tied in a loose ponytail, crooked and carefree. The cart was driving through the forest of flaming red maples, where maple leaves danced on their way to the ground. A leaf playfully landed on the shoulder of the youth, and he blew it off softly. Then he looked up at Cillian, speaking with a shadow of a smile. What do you want to know? Ask away. He looked teasing, yet somehow possessed the perfect composure of omniscience. Though he sounded youthful, his voice was deeper than that of a typical youth his age, and it was pleasant to the ears. Sitting upright in the cart, Cillian watched him thoughtfully for a moment and said, Crimson rain-sought flower evokes quite the imagery. Do you know where it came from, my friend? Out of respect, Cillian didn't say my little friend. The youth sat up casually, propped an arm on a raised knee, and fixed his sleeves. He replied unconcerned. Nothing major, really. Just that there was once an incident where he cleaned out the nest of another ghost, and a shower of blood rain poured down from the skies. He saw a flower getting battered by the bloody rain, so he tilted his umbrella and shielded it. Cillian pictured it in his head, imagining such an act of elegance under the rancid shower. He then thought about the burning of those 33 temples and laughed. Does Huatong pick fights often? The youth answered, not often. Depends on his mood. What was he like before his death? Cillian asked. Definitely not a good person, the youth replied. What does he look like? The youth raised his eyes to look at him when he heard the question, tilted his head, and stood up before sitting down next to Cillian. What do you think he looks like? He turned the question on Cillian. Seeing the youth close up, Cillian thought he was too handsome for words, but his beauty was deadly like a sword, sharp and mesmerizing, making it hard to stare head on. Cillian only met his eyes for a moment, then lowered his eyes in defeat. He turned his head slightly and continued to ask, if Huatong is a big shot ghost, I'm sure he has many forms and changes often. The youth arched his brows at Cillian, turning away, and replied, yeah, but there are still times when he'd want to use his real face, of course. We're talking about his true form. It might have been his imagination, but Cillian thought the distance between the two of them seemed to be a little wide, so he turned his face back around. Then I feel his true form is probably a youth like you. The youth lifted his lips slightly. And why do you say that? Cillian replied, no reason. You say whatever and I think whatever. Everything's whatever, that's all. The youth laughed. Who knows? But he's blind in one eye. He pointed to his right eye. And this one. That was nothing outrageous. Cillian recalled one of the many backstory versions where Huatong wore a black eye patch to hide that missing eye and asked, do you know what happened to his eye? That's a question everyone wants the answer to, the youth replied. Others asked because they wanted to know what Huachang's weakness was. But Cillian asked purely out of curiosity. He didn't say anything, and the youth continued. He dug it out himself. Cillian was taken aback. Why? A moment of madness, the youth answered. He could dig out his own eye when struck by madness? Cillian was now more curious about this Crimson Ghost King than ever. It couldn't have been something simple, well, as a moment of madness, but there were probably no more details about that story. Cillian pressed on. Does Huachang have any kind of weakness? He wasn't expecting the youth to have an answer. It was just a casual question. If Huachang's weakness was so easily known, then whatever the rumored weakness was couldn't possibly be true. But the youth answered immediately. His ashes. If one got a hold of a ghost's ashes, one could take command of said ghost. If the ghost disobeyed, then by getting rid of the ashes, the ghost would dissolve and its soul disintegrate. This was common knowledge, but using it on Huatong seemed fruitless. Cillian smiled. There's probably no one who can obtain his ashes, so that weakness is the same as having none at all. You never know, the youth said. There are circumstances where a ghost would voluntarily give his ashes away. Like the bet he had with those 33 heavenly officials? Yeah, right, the youth scoffed. He didn't need to say the words for Cillian to understand that he meant there was no way Huachang would have lost. He continued, there's a custom in the ghost realm where if a ghost has a special someone, they entrust their ashes to that person. That was akin to handing over one's life to another person. Such passion. What a charming tale that would be. Cillian commented, interested. I didn't know the ghost realm had such a romantic practice. They do, the youth said, but not many dare to practice it. Cillian thought as much. It wasn't only ghosts who deceived humans. There were humans who deceived ghosts, too. There must be endless tales of manipulation and betrayal. Cillian sighed. It certainly is painful to think about. to have given everything for love and lose everything in return. The youth laughed out loud. What's there to be afraid of? If it were me, have no regrets giving away my ashes. Who cares if they want to disintegrate or just scatter my ashes for fun? Cillian grinned, then suddenly realized that they still didn't know each other's names, despite having chatted for so long. My friend, what's your name? The youth raised one hand over his forehead to block out the rays of the blood-red sunset, and squinted his eyes as if loathing the sun. Me? I'm third in my family. They call me Sunlam. He didn't say his full name, and it wasn't Celine's place to ask. My family name is Xie, given name Lian. Are you heading to Puti village too? Sunlung lay back in the hay, put his arms behind his head, and crossed his legs. Don't know. I've no destination in mind. It sounded as if there was a story to his words, so Xielian gently asked, What's the matter? Sunlung sighed. My parents were quarreling and kicked me out. I walked for a long time but had nowhere to go. I almost passed out from hunger on the streets before finding somewhere at random to lie down. The clothes on the boy's back looked casual, but the material was of high quality. With the knowledgeable way he spoke and how carefree he appeared, Celian had long since thought he was a boy from a wealthy family. It must be difficult for a respectable young man to wander so long on his own. Celian understood that feeling. Hearing he was hungry, Celian searched through his sack, but only found a small steamed bun. Good thing it hadn't turned hard yet. Want it? The youth nodded, and Celian gave him the bun. Sunlam took a look at Celian. What about you? I'm all right. Not hungry yet, Celian replied. Sunlam pushed the bun back. Then I'm all right too. Xielian looked at him, then split the bun in half and gave him half. You can have half, and I'll have the other half. Seeing this, Sunlight accepted the steamed bun and started munching. Watching him sit and eat a simple bun obediently, Celian felt like he was abusing the boy. The ox cart drove slowly over the rugged hills as the sun gradually set, and the two chatted in the back. The more they spoke, the more Celian thought Sunlung to be an extraordinary youth. At such a young age, his diction and behavior were already mature and elegant, calm and collected, as if there was nothing in this world he didn't know anything and nothing could stop him. Celian thought he was wise beyond his years, but sometimes he would still reveal the folly of youth. Celian said he was the shrine master of Puti Shrine, and Sunlung asked, Puchi Shrine? Sounds like there are plenty of water chestnuts to eat. I like them. Which god is it for? Having been asked that troublesome question again, Celian cleared his throat. The Prince of Xianle. You probably don't know him. The youth smiled, but before he could say anything, the ox cart suddenly shook violently. The two jerked with the cart, and Xiaolian reached to grab Sunlang, fearing he might fall. But just when his hand touched Sunlang, the youth shook off his hand as if burned. There was only a slight change in his expression, but Xiaolian saw it and thought maybe this boy actually disliked him. They'd had such a good time chatting all this way, though, hadn't they? But now wasn't the time to ponder. Xiaolian stood up and looked around. What's going on? The old driver responded. I don't know. Old Huang, why aren't you moving? Go on now. The sun had set and the ox cart was still deep in the woods, now filled with darkness. Old Huang, the axe, just stood there, stubbornly refusing to move, no matter how the old driver urged it. It kept mooing, wanting to dig its head into the earth and flicking its tail like a whip. This didn't feel right. Xiaolian was about to jump off the cart when suddenly the old driver pointed straight ahead and screamed. Farther up the road, a number of hovering balls of green flame were popping up here and there. Bunch of weird pauses there. Further up the road, a number of hovering balls of green flames were popping up here and there. They gathered and burned, floating through the woods. A group of white-clad figures slowly made their way toward them, carrying their own severed heads. Seeing this, Cillian cried, "Protect!" Rue flew out from his sleeve and wrapped itself in a circle around the ox cart from above, protecting the 3+1 beast. Cillian turned back and demanded, "What day is today?" The old driver didn't respond before the youth spoke up from behind. "It's Zongyuan." The middle of the 7th month, when the gates to the underworld opened. He didn't check his calendar before coming out today, and it just happened to be this Zangyuan festival. Cillian's voice dropped. "Stay close to me. We've run into evil tonight. If we go down the wrong path at the fork, we'll never return." And I'm going to split this one into 2 parts as well. Also, you may have noticed that the audio sounds so much better already. We got an OBS. Woohoo! Finally. Ugh. The audio on Streamlabs was not great. But thanks for bearing with it, y'all. I will see you in the next part.